Hello everybody, good afternoon. And on behalf of the Utrecht University Centre for Global Challenges, welcome to this annual lecture, Building a Better Society Together. Last year we had the first UGlobe lecture, and that was delivered by Carlota Perez when she received an honorary doctorate of this university. This year we're very happy to welcome the director of the London School of Economics, Lady Minouche Shafik, who last Friday got an honorary doctorate of Utrecht University. Minouche Shafik had an impressive career. Prior to LSE, she's held some important policy positions at, for example, the Bank of England, at DFID, and in the main institutions that guide and govern our global economy, the IMF and the World Bank. Her rich experience and knowledge, she bundled it in her book. It's here in Dutch translation. What We Owe Each Other, a New Social Contract, translated as Samen. It is based on an impressive amount of data, and then she pictures the framework for a future society. A society that is prosperous and equal, that is caring and competitive. And she's picturing not only the structure of such a society, but also the possible arrangements that could build it. We're very happy that she's here and to deliver her speech, and we're very happy to have a real audience. These are things I've come to appreciate very much in the past few years. Minouche Shafik will tell us about this inspiring book later on, What We Owe Each Other. After her lecture, there's ample room for discussion with you, the audience, but let me start with handing over to your host of this afternoon, Joost de Laat. He's the director of UGlobe and professor of global economic challenges. His field of research is reducing inequality in education, which is also an important element in Shafik's book. He will introduce this year's honorary doctorate. Joost.
Thank you very much, Marcia. And a warm welcome to everyone. So what should a social contract look like that better connects with the needs of the 21st century? This is the core question that Lady Dr. Minouche Shafik, director of the London School of Economics and recipient of an honorary degree here at Utrecht University this past Friday, asked in her most recent book, What We Owe Each Other, a New Social Contract for a Better Society. Throughout history, individuals, companies, civil society, and the state have pooled their resources to varying degrees to contribute to a system of collective benefits, some formal, some informal, what we call the social contract. And throughout history, societal challenges have required the social contract to be reassessed, sometimes tacitly, sometimes proactively, and sometimes through revolutions. As Lady Shafik argues, the world today is again experiencing fundamental changes and challenges, putting the social contract under pressure. Think of technological changes, including automation and artificial intelligence, which is generating unequal benefits. Think of changing gender roles that have given rise to changes in family size and female labor force participation. Aging populations are putting pressure on our health care systems. And climate change is generating new risks and challenges, particularly for young generations. The war being waged onto Ukraine is again putting the question of international solidarity front and center. So what should a social contract look like that better connects to the needs of the 21st century? Her approach in answering this question exemplifies Lady Shafik's broader work and personal journey. Growing up in Egypt and then the United States, daughter of a father who impressed on her that everything can be taken away from you, but not your education. And later spanning several decades in leadership positions, from the World Bank to the IMF, to the UK government, to now director of the London School of Economics. In her book, Lady Shafik finds inspiration from historical leaders like Beatrice Webb, co-founder of the London School of Economics and leading social reformer who at the start of the 21st century called for a new social paradigm, focused on ensuring human dignity and equal opportunities regardless of gender and background. But equally, she draws inspiration from Antonia, her host, mother of 12 and trained community health worker in the Amazon forest in Ecuador. As in her work more broadly, she takes a global perspective, highlighting the value of drawing inspiration and lessons from the concrete ways in which countries and societies from around the world have been shaping their social contracts in practice. She also takes a broad welfare perspective that includes not only income, but also subjective well-being, competencies, equality of opportunity, and freedom. And she draws heavily from academic insights, combining these with her lived experiences, working directly in some of the poorest countries, such as South Sudan and Bangladesh, to rich countries like the UK and the EU. And so, with that in mind, on behalf of the Utrecht Centre for Global Challenges, the Institutions for Open Societies strategic theme, and the Utrecht School of Economics, it's an honor to welcome you all here today for her keynote, and followed now by my dear colleague Ingrid Robijns. Thank you.
Thank you, Joost de Laat. Next, we will listen to Ingrid Robijns. She's Professor of Ethics of Institutions at this university. She's an economist and philosopher and leading a new and very interesting research called the Fair Limits Project. And that examines the moral limits of the resources a person or company can use, should use. She will give us an academic introduction to the work of Minouche Shafik. Ingrid Robijns.
Okay, well, first I want to say that I'm really delighted that Utrecht University has chosen to award Minouche Shafik an honorary degree, in particular for her work on the new social contract. And I've actually decided that I should not speak about her work because I don't want to kind of say something that she will then say herself. So I'll try to do some broader sketching of some relevant questions also to set the stage a little bit. I would just like to make three points. And the first one is about academia. I think that academia and society really need these kind of grand narratives, but that it would require us to do research and intellectual work in a different way. Because for those of you who haven't read the book, this is really a grand narrative of the well-known old tradition of visions for a different way of putting our society together. And why do we need these grand narratives? Because many citizens, but also policymakers, intellectuals, and politicians think that we should really replace neoliberalism with something else. The question, what kind of social contract we would have, is one that is being asked at many universities in the world. At Harvard University, the Srafa Center for Ethics has chosen it as its topic for the next couple of years. They call it a social compound. Stanford University Centre for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences has a programmatic paper that literally asks the question, what should replace neoliberalism? And although the term is kind of loaded, many people do not like to use it, and I do understand why. Even here at Utrecht, we have different groups that work on the question, how should the future look like? And for those of you who know Utrecht University, we have a group of people who work on institutions of open societies. We have another group of people, interdisciplinary, who work on pathways for sustainability. And in my understanding, the question of the social contract is where those two groups meet. So it's crucially important. And it's also in Dutch society that people understand that we need to go and argue and develop those grand narratives. Kim Putters, the current director of Sociaal Cultureel Planbureau, who for years has been regarded as the most influential Dutch politician or just intellectual, has called in a column in September in Financieel Dagblad that he urges politicians to develop those views. And he says, I quote, "I see a distinct role for the social sciences and humanities to help develop those views of a new social contract." The problem, and I won't delve into this into detail because it goes too far, is that academia is currently at a sort of a transition period in which we may have incentivized scholars and perhaps also students to do more fine-grained, very detailed work, and these grand narratives sound a bit too big. They also need synthesizing methods, but I'm hoping that the future will bring more of this. And this may also require us to collaborate more with investigative journalists. We also always encourage, and our policymakers, our Minister of Higher Education encourages scholars to collaborate with industry, but I think we should also collaborate with investigative journalists because together we can do this kind of work. So that was the first kind of setting the stage point I wanted to make. The second is that I think we must bring into the discussion questions about values and moral principles, and also questions about how we understand human nature. What do I mean with this? Let me give you an example and it will become clear. Take climate justice. Sustainability is an issue about well-being of the future, but there's also a very deep element of fairness, or better, unfairness about this. To summarize what is the result of a very large body of research in both climate sciences but also climate ethics, and I'm doing this a bit roughly, but just to keep it into 2 sentences, the countries that have caused climate change are not the countries that will be hardest hit by the consequences. The countries that have emitted most over time, historically, are not the countries that will have the famines, that will have the floodings. Well, floodings is actually, I'm no longer after last year whether we can say this, but there are some islands that are just disappearing under the sea level completely. So there is a very deep question here about justice on a global scale. Should there be international reparations for climate? I think that is a question that we should also ask. And we can ask similar hard questions about fairness of international trade relationships. And if we bring those questions into the discussion about the social contract, then we may come to the very disturbing and uncomfortable conclusion that actually we are able to have the social contract that we have because we are to some extent not having proper relations of fairness with other parts of the world. If that is true, that should be brought into the discussion of the social contract. So these are kind of questions from my corner of the woods in ethics and moral philosophy. And another one that comes from the humanities is the questions about human nature. How do we see ourselves? Neoliberalism has often stressed that both if you are successful and also if you happen to be disadvantaged, in the end, it's reducible to some choices you make yourself. And that centrality of the individual, their capacities, their choices, that is also something that is not given. We could also acknowledge a role for luck that is much bigger in our lives. And if we have these kind of discussions, it may also change how we think about what a fair social contract would be. My last point is that enabling a social contract that is fair will not happen without all of you making some contribution to it. And with this I mean all citizens should claim their place at the discussion table. It is crucially important that academics such as Minouche Shafik write very inspiring and important books such as this one. But all of us must see ourselves not just as students, workers, investors in our human capital, but we should also see ourselves as citizens. And we must raise our voice and make a contribution, not just to keep the social contract going, as Minouche Shafik very rightly, I think, argues in her book, but also in terms of deciding collectively what kind of social contract we should have. So we should all, in one way or another, be active citizens. That could be by joining a political party, joining an organization such as Amnesty International, or being an activist, or going to meetings where ideas are exchanged, such as this one. So I'll close by a quote from Minouche in the preface of her book. Yeah, now I need to get this green. The green one is the one I have to. So she talks about what enables a social contract and says, I quote, "Periods of great instability can result in a radical reordering of our society. What that reordering looks like depends on the institutions that are in place, which leaders are in power, and what ideas are in ascendance." And to this, I would like to add that it also depends on the civic contributions from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robijns. I think it's high time that we grant the floor to Minouche Shafik for her, as Ingrid Robijns rightly called so, a grand new narrative. Please, Minouche Shafik, take the floor.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I wanted to particularly enjoy what a pleasure it is to do it in person. It's really wonderful to be here, and particularly to visit Utrecht. Not only is Utrecht University one of the most beautiful and most prestigious institutions of higher learning, I can now count myself as an honorary alumna of the university, so I'm particularly proud to be here. And as I said in my speech at Dies Natalis on Friday, my career has been all about collaborations across the social sciences and across the world with people from very, very different backgrounds, ranging from the UK Civil Service, the Bank of England, the LSE, the IMF, the World Bank. And that collaboration across borders, across disciplines, is something that has been very central to my life, and also clearly something that is at the heart of the Centre for Global Challenges and what you're trying to do here in Utrecht. So let me turn to the topic of the day, which is a new social contract. And it's a huge topic, and I think I was grateful for Ingrid's use of the term grand narratives. It's a way of thinking about the world and the future and how we could organize our societies better. And you may well say, this is not a moment to be having these discussions. We're still in the midst of a global pandemic. There is a war in Europe again. And all of this casts an uncertainty alongside the fear of climate change. I often say we're facing, the triple crises of COVID, conflict, and climate. But I would argue that this is the moment to be debating these big issues. In the book, I talk about how often social contracts are renegotiated at times of crisis, and I think this qualifies as a crisis. My book is partly inspired by the work of one of my predecessors at the LSE, William Beveridge, who was a director of the school, who wrote the famous Beveridge Report, which created the modern welfare state in the UK. It founded the National Health Service, modern unemployment insurance, and pensions for all. And Beveridge wrote the report when the bombs were still falling on London. And I think that's a good reminder that even at these existential moments of crisis, we need to be thinking about the future. The Dutch welfare state, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, Verzorgingsstaat. Is that close? Not really. Is that all right? was conceived around the same time in the aftermath of World War II. And I think our current moment offers such an opportunity for a radical rethink. Now, let me first define my terms. What do I mean by the social contract? And for me, the social contract is what defines what we owe each other in a society. And that involves the norms, the rules, the laws, and the mutual obligations that bind us together as individuals, as firms, and within a state and across countries. That's my kind of working definition of the social contract. What does it mean in practice? It means very practical things like, are children raised at home by their mothers or grandparents, or does the state provide childcare centers or paid parental leave so that both parents can raise their children? How much of healthcare is the responsibility of individuals, and how much of it is paid through collective mechanisms like insurance or public funding? Do we expect employers to provide contracts with regular hours and benefits, and such as sick leave or pensions, or do we expect workers and their families to carry those risks of illness and old age? In more traditional societies, those responsibilities of what we owe each other tend to be delivered by families and communities, and the risks in life are carried by the family. In more advanced economies, those risks are usually include more of a role for the market and the state. But in every society, people are expected to contribute to the common good when they are capable adults and be looked after when they are young or old or unable to support themselves. So why do I think the social contract is broken? I think until the late 20th century, social contracts were built on the premise that families would have a sole male breadwinner, that women would look after the young and the old for free. There was a presumption that most people would stay married until they died and give birth to children only when married. They'd have steady employment with just a few employers over the course of a lifetime. And the skills that they accumulated in school from about the age of 6 to their, let's say, 20s, would be enough to last them a lifetime. And most people would only live a couple of years after retirement, and the care that they needed in old age would be provided by their family. Now, as I've described that social contract, I bet most of you are thinking, that bears no relationship to my life. Today, half of women are in the labor market. More women go to university than men. Between a third and a half of marriages in advanced economies end in divorce, and rates of divorce are growing in most developing countries. A growing proportion of children are born outside of marriage. The average worker has many more jobs over the course of a lifetime, and rather than working for just, say, 3 employers over your life, many people today work for 3 employers in 1 week. And while many developing countries are still transitioning from having more workers work in the informal sector, there are growing signs of informality in labor markets in advanced economies. I often joke that the gig economy is just a cool name for the informal sector. And of course, there's climate change, which brings massive risks that could disrupt our economies and the sustainability of our society. So I think the biggest disruptors to the modern social contract in the 21st century have been the changing role of women, which has fundamentally affected the way we raise children and look after the old, and technology, which has changed work and made it much more flexible and has big implications for what we need out of our educational systems. I think looking forward, the big threats to the social contract are around aging and climate change. Now let me start by just saying something about the difference between the social contract and the welfare state, because many people sometimes think they are the same. The social contract reflects all the ways that we organize things that we need delivered collectively through families, communities, employers, and the state. The welfare state is just one mechanism for delivering those collective goods. So there's often a misconception that the welfare state is primarily about redistributing income from the rich to the poor, what I call the Robin Hood function. Actually, that's a very small part of what the welfare state and the state as a whole does. The most important thing that the state does is what I call the piggy bank function, transferring income over our own lives, within a life, as opposed to across life. As an example, if there was a clever child, it could not go to the bank and say, I'm clever, bank, lend me money for my education, and when I grow up and get a job, I'll pay you back. It doesn't work that way. That's what the state does. The state invests in children when they're young, expects them to pay tax when they're middle-aged, and then also promises to look after them when they're older. Let me just show you a graph for the UK. And this illustrates how at different ages, whether people are taking money from the state or giving money to the state. And what it shows is that when people are young, from about the age of 0 to their early 20s, they are net recipients, mainly because of the spending on education, which is obviously a key part for young people. Taxation becomes a big part of people's life in the middle of their lives, when they are net contributors to the state, because they're employed and paying tax. And then as people get older, spending on particularly health becomes a much bigger part, the black dotted line, and people are net takers from the state. My colleague at the LSE, John Hills, did these calculations for the UK and showed that for most people, the amount they put into the state is roughly how much they take out over the course of their lives. Now, some people say, aha, but rich people, they pay more tax, and so they must put in more than they take out. But rich people tend to live longer, and so they take out more in terms of pensions and healthcare spending because their lives are longer. And so, roughly speaking, it evens out over the course of your own life. So let me say a few words about why I think the social contract is broken in certain areas and what I think a better social contract could look like. And I'm going to start with education. Now, we have made huge progress in almost every country in the world of investing in primary and secondary education. In most countries, most people now go to school. When I started work in international development, that was not the case, and that was our biggest objective was to get everyone into primary school. Now secondary school has become the norm in most countries, and most of the investment happens in primary and secondary education. The smallest investments are made at the pre-primary level and at the tertiary, at the level for adult education. Here you can see, let's look at the Netherlands since, oops, sorry, that wasn't good. Let's see if I can make, I can make it. So here's the Netherlands, for example, with big spending on primary, secondary, and university education. Small amount for pre-primary and tertiary adult learning, which is the last bar. And that's the pattern for most countries in the world. I would argue that a better social contract would change the balance of that investment and invest much more in pre-primary and much more in adult learning. Why? Pre-primary. We know now from all the research on brain development that most of the important cognitive development occurs in the first 1,000 days of life. And if children don't get really good nutrition and mental stimulation in those first 1,000 days, no matter how much you spend on primary and secondary education, and no matter how good a school you send them to, they never catch up. And so if you really care about equalizing opportunities, you would invest more in pre-primary education. That's where the social mobility can start to happen. And the impacts can be very large. In the book I cite a study from Jamaica, where a child was, young children were visited by a community healthcare worker for once a week while they were infants. The children who got that visit, who worked with their parents to make sure they fed the children well, played with them, stimulated them mentally, as adults earned 42% more than the children who didn't receive that visit. So huge impact on those children's life chances. Similarly, adult learning is not very invested in most countries. Denmark is probably, and Sweden are probably the outliers in terms of spending a high proportion, about 1.7% of GDP in the case of Denmark, on adult learning, or what in the OECD terms is called active labor market policies, of helping adults in the workforce reskill and retool. This has become much, much more important in a world where people's careers will last not 30 years, but probably closer to 50 years going forward. And the idea that you get all the education you need by your early 20s and you're done, and that's going to last you for 50 years is inconceivable. And so I think a better social contract would change the shape of our educational system. And rather than just focusing all the investment on primary, secondary, and tertiary education, would expand the spectrum and do much more early for the sake of social mobility, and much more later for the sake of lifelong learning and workers being able to stay in the workforce much longer. Let me say something about work and the future of employment. So, as I said, one of the most striking things about modern labor markets is informality, or flexibility has become much more common. I've noticed as I was cycling around Utrecht the huge number of Deliveroo and Uber Eats and cyclists who were cycling around the city. And those workers who have those flexible jobs, in most countries, although I have to say the Netherlands stands out in this case as more progressive, in most cases, they don't get benefits. They have unpredictable incomes and no security about pensions, sick leave, and so on. Now, that flexibility in modern labor markets has been the source of a lot of efficiency, and a lot of the efficiency gains that we've seen have come from the introduction of flexible labor markets. And many of us have benefited from that as consumers, because many of the goods and services that we buy have become much cheaper because of flexible labor markets. On the flip side, the workers in those jobs face enormous insecurity. And I would argue that we could define a better social contract that strikes a better balance between flexibility for employers while maintaining security for workers. This chart shows you how countries organize their labor markets very differently. On this side, you have flexibility. As you move to the right, the labor market's much more flexible, easier to hire and fire, less job security. And on this side, you have protection, which means how much social insurance, basically, workers are provided. Most European countries are in this upper left-hand quadrant with not a lot of flexibility and fairly high levels of protection. And you can see the Netherlands, France, Germany, and so on. Many developing countries are in the low protection, low levels of social insurance provided by the state, and what appears here as low flexibility. But what you see in many developing countries is that the formal sector has very low flexibility, but the majority of workers are in the informal sector and so don't benefit from any of these protections. For me, the magic place to be is in the upper right-hand quadrant, countries that have high flexibility, but also high protection. I'll give you an example of the Nordic countries. If you look at countries like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, employers have very high degrees of flexibility. They can hire and fire at will. There are often no severance payments. And they actually have very high rates of labor turnover. And people get hired and fired. In fact, they have the highest rates of labor turnover in Europe. But it isn't a source of great social anxiety, because if you lose your job, unemployment insurance is pretty generous, covers about 80% of your previous wage, so your standard of living doesn't plummet. You're immediately put into an active labor market program to reskill and retrain. And by far the majority of people are back in work within a year. And they have the highest rate of employment anywhere in the world. I think that model, which they call flexicurity, gets the balance right between economic efficiency, but also social protection and equality. My third example of how we could design a better social contract is on intergenerational issues. Now, since the beginning of time, every generation has wanted to leave the next generation better off than they were. And yet I think we are at risk of leaving this coming generation with poorer prospects for their livelihoods, a big legacy of debt, and of course a severely damaged planet. I think we can see that phenomenon when we look at polling, where we ask people, will young people in your country have a better life than their parents? And the numbers are really shocking. In almost all the advanced economies, people feel that their children will have a worse life than theirs. In the developing world, it's a different story. There is still the expectation of young people having a better life than their parents. And I think what this reflects is many things. The fact that labor markets have changed in many advanced economies, that economic growth has slowed, that concern about climate is very high in some parts of the world, and that in many countries, younger generations are inheriting a big stock of debt that accumulated as both a result of the financial crisis in 2008 and the COVID crisis. So how can we put our intergenerational social contract right? I think a key element is investing hugely in the education of young people to enable them to be productive over what will be very long working lives. gosh, I don't know if I have that chart. Do I have that chart? No, I don't have that chart. In the book, I have a chart which shows what's happened to physical capital, human capital, and natural capital over the last 100 years. And what it shows is that we've built up a lot of physical capital, infrastructure, buildings, technologies, etc. Human capital, we've invested quite a lot, and that's grown by about 13%. But we've massively drawn down natural capital. And to compensate, in some ways, the next generation, we have to try and build up that natural capital again, investing in conservation and reducing carbon emissions. But we can also compensate them by making even more investments in their human capital. So in the book, I argue for that we should give all young people a lifelong learning endowment. Let's call it, you can call it 50,000 euros for every young person at the age of 18 to be able to draw on, to be able to invest in their skills for the rest of their lives. We also obviously need to do something on the environment and do what we can to try and work through the debt and pay down some of the debt so the next generation isn't burdened as much. So I've given you 3 examples: education, employment, and intergenerational justice, of how we could define a better social contract. What are the underlying principles that I think would guide what I think would be a better social contract? The first is that a better social contract should provide minimum security for all. There should be a minimum, a floor below which no one needs to go. And that's true in rich countries and poor countries. In poor countries, you can achieve this through what are called cash transfer programs, where you transfer small amounts of cash to the poorest households that protects them from going below some floor. In rich countries, you can have earned income tax credits, which make sure that if you earn a low wage, the society will top up your wage so you can lead a decent life. I'm not a fan of universal basic income, and I'm sure that will come up in the discussion. The reason I'm not a fan is that 2 reasons. One, the experiments that have been tried with universal basic income have had very modest impacts, because either the amount you transfer to everyone is too small to matter, and if you're going to transfer a lot to everyone, then you have to raise rates of taxation so much to channel resources through the state, through high taxes, and then redistribute to people, many of which don't need the income, because a universal basic income is universal. So I think in any advanced economy that's capable of targeting to the poorest, you can always do better than a universal basic income. But more fundamentally, I don't like universal basic income because it's like giving up on people. It's saying that there are some people who have nothing to contribute to society. And I think that violates the principle of the social contract. I think everyone has something they can contribute. And maybe it might not earn a very high income, but then you can top their income up. But I'd rather see people engaged in society rather than being told, you're just going to get a check from the state and you stay home. So that's my first principle, minimum security for all. My second principle is maximum investment in opportunity and capability. I think in too many places, talent is wasted in our societies. And that talent is often embedded in children who are born into poor families, in women, and for people who, for whatever reasons, didn't have luck in their life. Just as an illustration of how different societies have handled people's ability to improve their lot over their life, this chart shows you how social mobility works in different countries by asking how many generations does it take to go from the bottom of the income distribution to the middle in different countries. And what you can see is that in countries, well, let's pick the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it takes about 4 generations to go from the bottom to the middle. And that's quite similar to, say, the UK, the US. The Nordics, as always, do best. It takes only 2 generations in Denmark to go from the bottom to the middle. And in many parts of the developing world, you see these scary numbers, 7 generations, 9 generations. It means that nowhere in your conceivable set of life expectations would you expect your great-great-grandchildren to be well off. Now, this is not just unfair, this is incredibly inefficient. One of the most interesting studies that I cite in the book was done by a professor at the LSE with colleagues at Harvard called Lost Einsteins. And they look at data in the US of children who in year 4 in school have the exact same math and science skills. So equally good at math and science. And then they look in the future as to how many of those children go on to be inventors and have patents. So they link patent data to educational data to income data. And what do they find? They find that if you're a child who happens to be born in a rich family, you're 10 times more likely to have a patent, controlling for your math and science skills as a child. So you have the same capability, but if you're born in a rich family, 10 times more likely to be an inventor. If you happen to be born in Silicon Valley, you're 10 times more likely to have a technology patent than if you're born somewhere else in the United States. So where you're born and the family you're born into has these huge consequences. And what they calculate is that if we could equalize the opportunities and give those lost Einsteins an opportunity to be productive, you could quadruple the rate of productivity and innovation in the economy. So how can we create a society that taps into all that talent? I would argue that investing in those early years, those first 1,000 days of life, is part of it. I think giving all young people an equal entitlement to education through a lifetime learning allowance, and by providing vocational training later in life. I think all of those are ways to equalize opportunity. I think the other issue is, of course, making sure that opportunities are equal between girls and boys. And in most countries now, in almost every country in the world, we've closed the gender gap in schooling. So that's great. In fact, if you look globally now, as I said, more girls go to university than men everywhere in the world, not just in Europe, but in Africa, in Asia, and South Asia, and so on. The problem for girls in using female talent occurs when they have children. Girls and boys, and when they become men and women, they do equally well when they graduate. When they get their first job, they're paid more or less the same. And as soon as the first child is born, their incomes diverge. And of course, that's about childcare. And so creating a society in which we have much better provision of childcare is a key part of tapping into female talent. The other issue for women is unpaid work. On average in the world, women do about 2 hours more unpaid work than men around the world. I think in the Netherlands, it's about an hour. But in countries like Pakistan, it's many 6 or 7 hours more. And so having a more equal distribution of labor in the home as part of the social contract is another key element to tap into more female talent. So more generous parental leave, more public funding to support young families, and a fairer division of labor at home would mean that we would get much more out of the investment we're making in female talent in our society. The final principle for me is sharing risks better. I think there are too many risks that are being borne by individuals that would be more efficiently borne or managed collectively. For the example I gave in employment, where you can have flexibility but share some of the risks around employment collectively would make sense. One example I often cite is if you think about a world in which, think about what's happened to pensions. If you remember, pensions used to be attached to your employer. Now we recognize that people may have multiple employers in their life, and so pensions have become portable. You can carry your pension pot from one employer to another. We need something similar on benefits, where you have a benefit pot, and if you work for 3 employers in 1 week because you're a freelancer, each of those employers contributes a little bit into your benefit pot to pay for your sick leave, to pay for your pension, to pay for your holiday pay or your parental leave. And so finding a way to share risks more sensibly is a key part of a better social contract. So the obvious question you're going to ask me is this affordable? Can we afford such a social contract? So I would argue that some aspects of this we need to think about as investment. publicly supported childcare, early years education, lifelong learning would require more spending, but they also generate returns. We know on average globally, the average rate of return on investments in education is about 10%. The average rate of return to the S&P 500 in the equity market, which is the sort of higher return part of capital markets, is 8%. So education's a pretty good high return investment. You have to think long term, but it does generate a rate of return. There are other aspects of a better social contract which would require more outright spending. And here I'm thinking of pensions and healthcare in particular. On pensions, I should have mentioned, I think one of the key aspects of a fairer intergenerational social contract is for older people to work longer, to reduce the burden that young people will have to pay for their healthcare and pensions. So in the book, I suggest that we link pension eligibility to life expectancy mechanically. And so that as people are living longer, they should just expect to work a little bit longer over time. How do we pay for those bits of a better social contract that would cost more money in the near term? I think there are two places that I would look. The first is a carbon tax. And I think a carbon tax has many benefits, including accelerating the transition to net zero. And the second I would look at is particularly property taxes. 2/3 of global wealth is held in the form of property. We've seen a huge growth in wealth inequality around the world in recent decades. And I think a property tax would be one way to both raise revenue, but also start to address some of those wealth inequality issues. Now, what I'm not advocating is a kind of Robin Hood solution of let's tax the rich a lot and give money to the poor. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm calling for is actions that fundamentally change and equalize the distribution of opportunities in our society, which I think is far more powerful than redistribution. Some of the policies that I've advocated are what economists refer to as pre-distribution. Things you do like equalizing access to good education or providing additional investment in deprived communities. And those are things that empower those individuals affected and reduce the risk of chronic dependency on state support. And if we can achieve fairer outcomes in the labor market, then there's much less redistribution required afterwards. And I think that's a much more powerful solution than thinking along Robin Hood lines. There needs to be probably a bit of Robin Hood, but Robin Hood is not the answer. So for me, a new social contract is not about higher taxes, more redistribution, and a bigger welfare state. It's about a fundamental reordering and equalizing of the distribution of opportunities and security in our society. I would argue it would result in higher productivity and more efficiency, but also more security. I think we owe each other more. A social contract in which we invest more in each other, but also ask more of each other. A little bit less emphasis on me, a little more emphasis on we, would mean a social contract that I think would make us more productive, more efficient, more secure, but also happier. And I think the principles that I've described could provide the foundation of a social contract that recognizes how interdependent we are, enables everyone to fulfill their potential, but also asks everyone to contribute as much as they can for the common good. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I invite you to have a seat here.
Thank you.
Yeah, listening to you, I was like having this sigh, thinking, oh, I wish our government had your book at hand when writing their new coalition agreement. That would have helped a lot. It's interesting, you talk about the triple crisis. The triple crisis, we know it all. It's a crisis of COVID, of conflict, and climate. You say, and that is the right moment. More than ever, it's important to think about a new design for a new society, a new grand narrative, just like Beveridge did. at the same time, you see that this crisis, it also fuels populism. How we see politics at this time in the UK where you live, but also here with us, it's quite grim. Politics is grim. And it's interesting to read your book through, if you look through that pair of glasses, it's like an anti-populist manifest. Was it on purpose that?
It was on purpose, to be honest. I sort of started to think about these issues after 2016. 2016 was, as you recall, Trump was elected, populists were elected across the world. It felt like one country after another. And populist leaders were kind of spreading division and anger. And I, because I had spent my entire career in international development, I had seen this huge human progress over the last 30 years. You look at the numbers, we live longer, we're healthier, more people are educated, our incomes have gone up. And I was trying to reconcile the fact that we've had all this human progress when you look at the numbers, and yet people are so angry. And that anger spills over into politics and this kind of populist upsurge. And that was the real driver for me starting to think about this. And some people say it's capitalism. That's why we've got this, capitalism has created this anger and people feeling left behind by capitalism. And, I don't think it's capitalism per se. I think it's the fact that capitalism has always had a social contract underpinning it, and our current one is failing. We used to allow child labor, and then capitalism evolved and said, this is unacceptable, we can't have child labor, and the social contract evolved. I would also say there are many flavors of capitalism. Capitalism in Denmark looks very different than capitalism in the United States. So I don't think the problem is capitalism. I think the problem is the social contract underpinning our economy hasn't kept up with our society and our needs.
And if you then look at that year 2016, you just mentioned, it is the year when two sets of government had passed after the beginning of the financial crisis.
Yes.
Maybe that was also the moment in time that people realized, okay, the companies that caused this huge crisis that affected so much the middle classes and lower classes, these companies had remained unaffected.
Absolutely.
8 years, 10 years after.
Absolutely. And I think the rise of populism can be attributed to the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
And the sense, the term was, Wall Street was fine and Main Street suffered. And I think that's true in most countries. I think the response to the 2008 financial crisis, and I was involved in some of it because we were, looking at how to change financial regulations to prevent that from happening again. The response to the 2008 financial crisis was too technocratic. It was focused on how do we prevent banks from failing in this way again. And a lot of very important reforms were made to capital adequacy requirements and liquidity requirements and all that. That was really important. But nobody dealt with the distributional consequences. Who suffered, who won, who lost, and how do we make up for that?
So the middle and lower classes probably thought this social contract is not working for us.
That's right.
So they turned to parties who turned against the system.
Exactly.
But let's move on. Interdependence. It's a very important notion in your work. All the time. It's already in the title, Samen, together, what we owe each other. But in the past years, global interdependence became more and more problematic, I think.
Yeah.
If you look at COVID, of course, if you now also look at the Russian war, it's very difficult for, if it comes to these disasters, to live up to your moral principles because we're so interdependent. Do you feel that, global interdependence has failed in that respect?
Yeah. I have to say I'm very disappointed about how the world has handled COVID. And COVID,
in what respect?
Well, because if you had to write a textbook about a global challenge which had to be solved globally, you would have written the story of COVID. Crossing borders, contagious, completely subject to the emergence of new variants, and so unless you solved it everywhere, it was going to continue to spread. It was a classic, what economists call a global public good, a problem that had to be solved globally. And yet what did we do? We all tried to solve it from our national silo. And it failed.
Yeah.
And some people say that COVID was a dress rehearsal for climate change. And it's not very encouraging how the world came together to solve this problem. You know, what we should have done is focused on providing vaccines first and foremost to those parts of the world where it was most severe. We should have tried to reach the most vulnerable groups in every country in the world as quickly as possible. We should have shared more and recognized our interdependence, and we didn't.
No. And do you feel global interdependence has gone too far, or would you say we fail in managing the consequences of it?
Yeah. So I think I would say we fail in managing the consequences of it. I think I am worried about, you know, part of the huge progress that we've made in the last 40, 50 years is because of interdependence and that nasty word, globalization. Mm. That's why we're richer. That's why our economies are so much more efficient than they were 50 years ago. And unless we manage the consequences better, we are facing a backlash. You know, there is a lot of talk about we're entering a deglobalization cycle now, that the world is going to be broken up into big regional blocks.
And does that worry you?
You know, it means being poorer. It means being poor. It means accepting that we will be less well off than we could otherwise be.
Because of a lack of efficiency?
Yeah, yeah. Because we know that if you trade, you're more efficient. If you're more open, you know, the Netherlands has this long history of being a very open economy. Openness makes you richer. But if you cannot deal with the social consequences of globalization, you will be poor. You know, that you will have this political backlash. Someone once asked me, why did, you know, you spent your whole life on working on international issues. Why did you write a book about national social contracts? Mm-hmm. And it's partly because I realized that unless we have better national social contracts, you can't persuade citizens to cooperate internationally. If they feel that globalization is hurting them and their communities, they will not support an open economy and an open society. And so it's almost a good social contract is a precondition to an open economy.
Yeah, so you do say, if I get you right, that these social contracts, they have to be organized at national level in order to be open, prepared to be open.
Yeah. So I'll give an example. And then go to your wider point. So, you know, if an automobile worker in Detroit feels like their job is being replaced because they're having to compete with China, they will support protectionism and populism and so on. The truth is, it's probably not the Chinese worker that they're competing with. It's the fact that the technology has changed and automation is coming. But the perception is that you're competing with other parts of the world. And so you have to offer that worker serious reskilling, retraining, opportunities for new jobs, and so on, in order to sustain political support for open economies. Your wider point about, is it national or is it international? So I discovered actually that one of the Greek Stoic philosophers had a very good metaphor, and he talked about our concentric circles, that our obligations are greatest to our immediate family, and then to our community, and then to the citizens of our state, but then also to the rest of humanity, that we do have obligations to people in other parts of the world. It isn't just national. Of course, they're greater at the national level. As citizens, we pay tax. That tax revenue goes to support people who we're never going to meet in our life, but we accept as a citizen that we have to do that. But we also have obligations to people outside our own nation states. When the humanitarian crisis occurs, for example, and you know, look what's happening now with people opening up their homes to people from Ukraine, or people offering money to charity when there's a famine in another part of the world. So we do have obligations to the rest of the world, and sometimes we forget that.
Yeah. Well, these examples seem to be quite self-evident, but Ingrid Robijns, she actually mentioned a less evident thing whether we should be prepared to pay reparations for the damaging climate change, like the northern of Kenya, for example. Now it's so dry, people are starving, and that is because of the climate change we caused.
Yes.
But I don't think I mean, there's not much discussion about that. We don't seem to be prepared
to do that. Yes. So I think reparations are really complicated because where do you stop? Where do you start and where do you stop? Because you could go back to, you know, thousands of years and try and figure out, well, this country invaded that country, or this country did this damage to that country, and it's very difficult. But, so I don't often like to think of it as in a reparations framework, but what I do think is you do have to address past wrongs in some way. And so I think the discussion on climate change, where the developing world is saying we need 100 billion per year to invest in adaptation and mitigation to deal with the consequences of climate change for us and to help us transition to net zero, that is a very legitimate claim. And I think looking at it as investment to compensate for past damage as opposed to reparations is a more productive way of thinking about it.
Well, let's turn to something that might be a positive note. Last year, the OECD convinced and had 136 countries, if I'm right, to sign this
corporate taxation.
Exactly, a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. So in a way, that was a revolutionary deal. And at the same time, you write also in your book, and there's some interesting charts about it, saying, look how corporate tax rate has reduced in the past decades. So this global minimum corporate tax rate is 15%. That sounds like even less.
Yeah. So I do think that was a step forward. The idea that there would be a minimum tax, that you would move away from this endless race to the bottom of tax competition, is a good thing. I think that's a good thing. I do think we need to go further and need to think differently about corporate taxes. You know, the level is low. The other dimension, which is very difficult, is where you pay, and part of the
changed too.
That changed too.
Like the big tech companies, like the Google, Amazons, they can now levy taxes where consumers pay for their goods.
Exactly.
Instead of taking their profit to tax havens.
Exactly. And I think that needs to be pushed further and the loopholes around that closed. And I think that's a really important piece. Then, you know, it goes back to the social contract. Corporations should pay tax in the communities in which they operate. And they owe something to that community because that's where they earn their income. That's where they have their factories or provide their goods and services. So I think that's an essential piece of a fair social contract. I think there are a lot of developing countries who feel that the OECD deal was inadequate because it doesn't address many of their concerns, and there's quite a lot written in the sort of tax justice literature, which does quite an interesting critique of the OECD deal. So I don't think it's enough, but I do agree with you. At least it's a step in the right direction.
At least it's a step forward, yeah. And then what I find interesting in your book is you often talk about efficiency. You say we have to gain in efficiency in order to improve our productivity, because that is the way to pay for this new social contract. For example, you point to online shops. You say, look at COVID, when we all appeared suddenly to be able and prepared to shop online, and what a gain in efficiency that is. At the same time, I was wondering, how would that evolve if you have more and more efficient online shopping? I mean, look at the centers of towns like Utrecht. They will be quite empty. Yeah. Isn't there a huge tension there?
Yeah. I have to say, I was admiring Utrecht because there are all these local shops. And there are, in the city centre, there are very few big chains. And it made it very distinctive because the shops were local and sold local goods, and it was really appealing. And I talked to a shopkeeper just yesterday, and I said, how does this work? Is there a regulation that gives incentives to... He said, no, it's because people here like to shop in local shops. And I thought that was really a very insightful statement. I think...
But that doesn't, I mean...
It's not a solution.
It's not a solution, and it's not, I think the general movement is different. It's from big chains and stores that also have very strong online commerce, whereas the local shopkeepers can't compete with that.
Yeah.
And then you get like empty city centers. You see that I mean, Utrecht is probably very distinct and not general, but you've got other cities who have like empty city centers with rising criminality and more sense of insecurity. And so that's a different direction.
No, I agree with you. I think we're still very much in transition as to what this online life will look like for people. I think city centers, I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think city centers are evolving, and I think we're thinking of new reasons to go to city centers. And shopping is just one of them. And I think some cities are beginning to think about how can we create attractive spaces where people, because people in the end, as we are all here together, want to be together. I think we all miss that. On the other hand, people really, I'm thinking especially of like older people, the advantages of being able to get your food delivered at home for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to go to the shops is a huge plus. And so I think this is something that's still up for grabs and up for debate. I don't have a good answer yet.
Yeah. I'm afraid to have another difficult one.
Okay.
Yeah, may I?
Please.
No, because of course, you write and speak a lot about the interdependence of people, but there's another important disconnection, and of course you do mention the climate crisis and the disconnection with our ecological system. I was wondering, how would you reconcile the necessity for economic growth with, of course, the scarcity of resources and the damage we do to that ecological system?
Yes, so I am not, I often get asked the question, oh, well, do we just have to have zero growth to save the planet? Is that the answer? I don't buy that. I think we need radically different kinds of growth, and we need to change the incentives, which is why I strongly support a carbon tax for a different kind of growth. We can strongly incentivize more investment in renewables. We can subsidize technologies that are innovative that will accelerate the transition to net zero. We can invest more in conservation. But those are decisions that have to be made. It's not going to happen in any way if we don't change any of the current. Yeah, it's not going to happen by itself. And we have to accept those changes. It is surprising to me how slow the progress on carbon taxation has been.
Well, that's because there are huge interests with big companies.
Huge interests. I would even support, and there's been quite a lot of interesting work done, but, the problem with carbon taxation is often people worry it will be regressive, and so poor people will be hit harder. So you remember the demonstrations in France with the Gilets jaunes was very much, it wasn't that they didn't want to act on climate, it's that they didn't want to be the only ones paying the price. But you can now look, there's some very interesting work that's been done that looks at revenue neutral carbon taxation. And so you raise the carbon tax, but you compensate low-income households for the higher prices. And so in the end, it doesn't have the distributional effect. So the poor don't pay more than the rich do. But what it does is it radically changes the prices that people face and will incentivize people to change their behavior. And so there are ways to do this in a way that would be politically progressive. But we haven't, to be frank, seen a huge amount of political will from our leaders.
No, and the difficult thing is that, like, if we don't manage the equal, fair distribution of the costs, the energy transition, sustainability won't work, because of course now this energy transition is fostering actually the populist anger.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's the issue, as you say, of who pays the costs of the transition, both within countries richer versus poorer people, and between countries, richer versus poorer countries. That's the nub of the issue. Now, I also happen to think that the energy transition requires upfront costs, but will generate enormous returns. You know, moving away from fossil fuels will mean we'll all have cleaner air and we'll have fewer health problems, and the respiratory illnesses that are so prevalent in our societies will diminish, and that will reduce healthcare spending, as an example. You know, if we change our diets in ways that are better for the environment, we'll actually be healthier and live longer. And
double win.
Double win. So there are many aspects which will generate returns. Not all aspects, but many aspects which will generate returns. But the challenge is the upfront investment that we need now to generate those returns later.
I see that the clock that I was relying upon is not working, so I'm working on my inner clock. I had promised, of course, the audience to have the opportunity to have some questions for you. So let's move to the audience. Is there anyone who has a question for Minouche Shafik? And we do have a mic that will come to you. Okay, yeah. There's Luc with a mic. Oh, there's a question over there. Yes. Oh, please, if you could stand, say your name, and then you can ask your question.
Joel Anderson, Director of the Ethics Institute. One of the things that struck me in the book and in your presentation is the emphasis on a sort of investment mindset.
Yeah.
That growth and the solutions will come through front-end investment, and then the question is, what are the best strategies and the mechanisms and the institutions to support that? But when I looked at that graph about hope in the future, I wonder if it's not going to be a very hard sell for many of the countries where the expectations are that things aren't going to get better, that the next generation will be doing worse. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts about how to, as it were, sell that message, which I find compelling, of an investment framework with people who are mostly just concerned about things getting worse?
No, it's a very good question. So I'm going to step way back to answer that question, which is, as I used to be a central banker, and one of the big dilemmas in central banking is, why are interest rates so low in the world? Why are interest rates so low? Because savings are very high, because the populations are aging, and investment is very low in the world. And so, as we know, interest rates are what balance savings and investment. So interest rates are very low because people don't have confidence in the future, right? And I would argue that actually, when interest rates are low, that's supposed to encourage investment, right? Because it's cheap to borrow. And you know, even though interest rates are starting to creep up a little bit, because we've got some inflation, they're still at incredibly historic lows by any measure. So this is a moment for investment, I would argue. Now, in many countries, public investment has been cut back in many countries. And so we could increase public investment. And you look across Europe, countries like Germany is a really good example, where public investment has been cut way back. You know, Germany, the country of great infrastructure, is now ranked one of the lowest in the OECD for the quality of its infrastructure. Now is a moment to invest in new green infrastructure that will transform the German economy. Same in the Netherlands. And what we know is that public investment, periods of high public investment crowd in private investment. When companies see government investing, that creates spillovers onto the private sector and can create new opportunities for the private sector. And so I see those two things as synergistic. And I think a bold public vision for investment would also encourage more private investment. And I think that is the solution to a better social contract. It's the solution to the transition to net zero. And it's also a way to get interest rates off the floor, which is a problem for central banks.
Yeah. Just to dig a bit deeper on that, you say the interests are so low, there's little investment. Yeah. I wonder, what is then the role of this quantitative easing that we've had for 10 years, where there's so much money has flooded the financial markets, and that money was, of course, meant to invest in the economy, whereas lots of that money has become financialized.
Correct.
Into the stock markets and into property.
Yes.
Do you feel that quantitative easing has been a failure?
Well, I think quantitative easing was necessary because there was, it's very hard to go negative on interest rates. There's a limit to how negative central banks can take interest rates. And quantitative easing was a way to stimulate the economy, given you were already at what we call the zero lower bound. So I think it was necessary. I think, though, part of the problem is that, as you say, a lot of that quantitative easing ended up raising asset prices, both in terms of capital markets, but also property prices. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to figure out, how do we incentivize that investment to go elsewhere? And that's why I think a more progressive public policy around public investment and maybe some property taxation, or taxation of, of dividends and wealth taxes, mm-hmm. might push some of that investment to areas that might, say, help the transition to net zero or accelerate investment in education.
Okay, thank you. Another question in the audience. There's one there in the middle, Luke, behind you. Or maybe it's easier for Sjoukje.
Hi, my name is Judith. First of all, thank you for your talk. I'm a public administration and energy science student. And at the beginning of your talk, you started with the 3 stockpiles. So the human capital, the natural capital, and the physical capital. Mm. And you said that to future generations, we owe it to them to invest in a human capital because the natural capital is decreasing a lot. But I was wondering, why does this investment in human capital then need to be expressed in terms of economic productivity, economic efficiency? Because won't that ultimately become at the detriment of natural capital again? And why, maybe I'm privileged as a Utrecht citizen, of course, but why can't we measure this human capital in terms of hours of meaningful service at the bed of a sick person, or bringing the craftsmanship back into the city center? And why does it need to be economic productivity again?
So I think I'd say a couple of things to that. First, in terms of how the stock of capital has evolved, there's a really nice piece of work by Partha Dasgupta on the economics of biodiversity, which looks at the data on this very clearly. And clearly, we have to invest more in natural capital. We have drawn down natural capital to a huge degree, and we clearly need to invest more in that. So investing more in conservation and so on has to be part of the answer. Investing more in human capital, one of the questions, big debates in environmental economics is capital substitutable? So just to give you an example, if I cut down a forest, but I invest a lot in your education, does that compensate? Because you could be better off because you've got so much more education, but you've lost your forest. And is natural and human capital substitutable? And I think there is a little bit of substitutability up to a point, which is why I argue that part of the way we redeem ourselves vis-a-vis the next generation is to invest in their education. I'm also really worried, frankly, about the next generation because there's fewer of you and there's going to be a lot of old people. And someone's going to have to pay for all that healthcare and pension. And unless you're very productive, it's going to be very difficult. So that's why I'm a little bit focused on investing in human capital and increasing the productivity of the next generation. But on your wider point about how are we measuring, why are we just measuring this in terms of GDP? I think that's a very good point. Economics has, to be fair, we've done quite a lot of work on better measuring of alternatives to GDP. And I think we need to mainstream that now in the way countries measure their progress. Most of our economic models still don't penalize you very much for depleting the environment. And we need to embed that in our economic modeling, and we're trying to do some work on that at the LSE. But we're also developing alternative measures. So one of the things that we've been doing, and there's now actually a big literature on measuring well-being. So, you ask people on a 1 to 10 scale, are you satisfied with your life? And that measure of subjective well-being is becoming a much bigger part of policymaking in many countries. So just to give an example, in the UK, the Office for National Statistics collects data on things like, they ask people, if you had a crisis, do you have a friend to turn to? Do you have neighbors that you speak to? How often do you speak to your neighbors? How often do you speak to your friends? And all of these are seen as measures of well-being and what economists would call social capital in a society. And I think more and more, not many, but more and more countries are saying we're not just going to look at what happens to GDP, but we need to assess the impact on well-being. It was a factor during COVID. Countries were looking at the well-being data. And the one thing I'll just leave you with is we've done some very interesting research on elections and well-being. And most politicians think that if GDP goes up during my tenure, I'll get reelected, right? People vote their pocketbook. That's the conventional wisdom. Our research, looking at parliamentary elections across Europe, hundreds of parliamentary elections over many decades, shows that what really matters whether political parties get reelected is whether well-being improves during that party's term of office. So I say this whenever I meet a politician, is if you want to get reelected, don't focus on GDP, focus on your citizens' well-being. And I think that is a good sign of where things might be in future, I hope.
The Netherlands is such an interesting case on that one, because it's now 20 years ago. I don't know if you know this name, Pim Fortuyn. Yeah, there was this politician that like skyrocketed in popularity. Now there's like a TV series being made on that. But when he became so incredibly popular that he might have become the prime minister if he hadn't been killed, that was at a time after two governments of Social Democrat, Wim Kok, who just couldn't believe that there was something wrong with his reign, so to say. He was like, well, you know, all the GDP has gone up, you know, all the statistics were positive.
Yes.
And he just didn't see that there was an undercurrent of well-being
deteriorating.
So interesting.
I remember when I was at the IMF, we had the same problem with the Middle East.
Yeah.
The macro numbers kept improving, and yet the Arab Spring came. And again, it was that disconnect between just looking at the economic data and ignoring how people actually felt about their lives. So I maybe these kinds of examples will make politicians focus more on
other parameters.
Yeah. Exactly.
Let's look to the audience. Is there on this side of the venue? Yes, please.
Thanks. I'm Cindy, Chair of Study Association ECU 92 for all economic students and bachelor students of economics and business economics. And I had a question relating to what you said about recognizing female talent or talent of minorities in general. Because in the Netherlands, there's been quite a big discussion about the female quota and that there needs to be a certain percentage of, for example, leadership positions filled by females. But then the discussion, whether that will decrease the skills an individual has and that you're just being hired for your gender and not for your skills. Yeah. So my question was, in general, what are your thoughts on the female quota? But then also, how do you think we should deal with these misconceptions? Because personally, I think it's not about equal talent, but about equal opportunities. But it's a very big discussion, and I have it come up very often as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
So it's very interesting. I observe that people's views on gender quotas for women vary with age. So when you're young, you think, we shouldn't have quotas, everybody on their own merit. And then as women get older, and I just noticed this among my peer group, they get so fed up with how slow progress is that they say, we need quotas. We're never going to get there if we keep relying on a natural process. I would also point you to a very good study published in the American Economic Review, which is a highly credible economic journal, by a colleague of mine at the LSE, Tim Besley, with a colleague in Sweden, that looked at what happened to in Sweden when they imposed gender quotas in political parties and said that political party lists had to include a certain number of women. And the title of the article is The Tragedy of the Mediocre Man. Because what happened in Sweden was not all these unqualified women were forced into these positions because of the quota. It was all the mediocre men who got pushed out as a result of the introduction of all this female talent. So I leave you with that idea of the tragedy of the mediocre man.
Yeah, but then we've got all these mediocre men now turning to Jordan Peterson, telling them to be masculine again. And yeah. More questions here, maybe. Yes, here's a question.
Okay, I'm Johan Schot. I'm also from the Center for Global Challenges. I want to talk a bit about the 21st century. I'm an historian by training. And my question is whether this is really a revival of something that happened in the 20th century or whether it's really a departure. Because one of the things that happened in the 19th and 20th century, of course, we built nation states. And they were able to organize the distribution function of the economy, at least in the West.
Yeah.
So I see your plea as a kind of revival, but it needs a strong nation state. So how optimistic are you that we will have a state to deliver on this? I'm very pessimistic, let me say that. So I'm wondering, what are the signs of hope?
Yeah.
But the second point is, the question was raised before about climate change, because your work also relates to Polanyi, who talks about re-embedding in society. But what about re-embedding in nature? Is that not
re-embedding in the nation?
In nature.
Oh, in nature. Nature.
You know, we talk about biodiversity loss, climate change. Can we really deliver on that with your program? Because what we know about taxation, the carbon tax, it will not lead to a transition. There's a lot of work on this. It leads to optimizing of the current systems, but not a departure. And the last point about the 21st century is that we should really consider the fact that we will have major disasters. It's not a probability anymore. It's a certainty. So how does your program deal with that? Because that will lead to a lot of inequality, because some people have to take the impact. Sorry for the long question. But the real issue is this future-proof, your program?
So I mean, you're right that a lot of this is about the role of the state and rethinking the role of the state. And I would argue that part of what I'm talking about is that we need a different kind of state for the 21st century than the state that we had in the 20th century. And, you know, like your point about, your final point on natural disasters, yes, we have seen that we get many more natural disasters now because of climate change. And so the state's role in providing insurance to society is going to become much more important than it was before. You know, in the welfare state in the 20th century, when it evolved, was around providing people insurance around sickness, old age, and unemployment, right? That was the essential underpinnings of the Beveridge welfare state. But now, look what happened with COVID. What did the state do? In every country, not just the advanced economies, but in developing countries, the state laid on insurance against COVID, right? There were furlough schemes. There were all sorts of schemes put in place to help people who were sick. Businesses were kept afloat that otherwise would have collapsed because of lockdowns and restrictions on mobility. And I think most people look at that reaction to a disaster, not a natural disaster, but a health disaster, and think, thank goodness the state did that. Think of how many families would have been made destitute and how many companies would have been bankrupt if society hadn't provided a great big insurance mechanism for all of us. And it worked. It worked. And I think that will change people's expectations. And I think that's a really good example of a new role for the state. You know, hopefully we won't have another pandemic soon. But I think going forward, people will expect now the state to provide national insurance for major catastrophes. And it was economically rational because all of those companies who lost all their business because of COVID, retail, hospitality, travel, and so on, would have disappeared, and all of that capital investment would have been lost. And so I agree with you that this is all about thinking about the new challenges we face and how to redesign the state in order to address them. And I think the issues around nature are in a similar vein, in terms of natural disasters.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our session this afternoon. Thank you so much, Minouche Shafik, for this annual lecture, for the discussion we had. It was so inspiring, I think. Just like your book, it has so many examples that really help in rethinking the grand order, actually. UGlobe also wants to thank its partners in this lecture, and that is the Utrecht University School of Economics and Institutions for Open Societies. And finally, thank you, our audience, for being here with us, for your interesting questions. And of course, we hope to see you again next year. And enjoy this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.